A former professional football career has now become the center of a homicide investigation that is drawing national and international attention. U.S. authorities have arrested Darron Lee, a former NFL linebacker, in connection with the fatal stabbing of his girlfriend in Tennessee. According to investigators, the victim, whose name has not been publicly released, was found dead following what police describe as a violent domestic conflict that escalated into a deadly attack. Law enforcement officials allege that evidence recovered from the scene points to a physical altercation leading up to the killing. Court documents indicate that investigators are treating the incident as an intentional act, and Lee has now been formally charged with first-degree murder, one of the most serious charges under U.S. law. Once known for his presence on the football field, Lee now faces a dramatically different reality inside the criminal justice system. Authorities stress that the case remains under active investigation, but say the arrest followed the collection of forensic evidence, witness information, and scene analysis that they believe supports the charge. The case has sent shockwaves through both sports circles and the broader public, raising renewed questions about domestic violence, warning signs, and how quickly personal conflicts can turn fatal behind closed doors. This is not a story about fame or athletics anymore. It is a story about a life lost, a violent confrontation, and a former professional athlete now standing accused of murder. In the early hours of what authorities describe as a violent, domestic incident, a private relationship turned into a homicide scene, one that has now placed a former professional athlete at the center of a first-degree murder case. U.S. law enforcement officials have confirmed the arrest of Darron Lee, a former NFL linebacker, in connection with the stabbing death of his girlfriend in Tennessee. The victim's name has not been released publicly, a decision authorities say is meant to protect family members and preserve the integrity of the ongoing legal process. According to investigators, officers responded to an emergency call reporting a disturbance at a residential location. When they arrived, they found the woman suffering from severe stab wounds. Despite emergency medical efforts, she was pronounced dead at the scene. Lee was taken into custody shortly afterward and later charged with first-degree murder, indicating that prosecutors believe the killing was intentional and supported by substantial evidence. For many members of the public, the name Darron Lee is associated not with crime, but with professional football. Lee built a high-profile athletic career through years of elite competition, discipline, and public recognition. That background has now become an unavoidable part of the story, not because it excuses or explains what prosecutors allege happened, but because it underscores the shock surrounding the case. Legal experts note that cases involving former professional athletes often draw heightened scrutiny, not because the law treats them differently, but because public expectations do. Fame creates familiarity, and familiarity can distort perception. Courts, however, operate on evidence alone. Authorities have emphasized that Lee's past career has no bearing on the charges he now faces. Inside the courtroom, he is treated like any other defendant accused of a serious, violent crime. Investigators allege that the fatal incident followed an escalating domestic conflict. According to preliminary findings cited by police, evidence at the scene, including signs of a struggle and the nature of the victim's injuries, suggests a violent confrontation immediately before the stabbing. Officials have not released specific details about the weapon used or the exact sequence of events, citing the active investigation and upcoming court proceedings. However, they have confirmed that forensic evidence, combined with scene analysis and early witness information, form the basis for the first-degree murder charge. In Tennessee, first-degree murder charges are typically pursued when prosecutors believe the killing involved intent, premeditation, or circumstances defined by statute as especially serious. While the prosecution has not yet presented its full case publicly, the charge itself signals the level of confidence authorities believe they have in the evidence. Lee was formally arrested and booked following the incident. Court records indicate that he is currently being held as the case proceeds through initial hearings. Bail conditions, if any, are subject to judicial review and may depend on factors such as flight risk, severity of the charge, and public safety considerations. At this stage, Lee is charged, not convicted. Under U.S. law, he is presumed innocent unless and until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in court. Prosecutors will now be responsible for presenting evidence that supports every element of the charge, while the defense will have the opportunity to challenge that evidence and present alternative explanations. Authorities have not publicly confirmed whether prior domestic violence reports existed in this case. However, experts emphasize that fatal domestic incidents are often preceded by escalating conflicts that may never reach police attention until it is too late. Domestic violence cases present unique investigative challenges. Much of what occurs happens in private, without witnesses. When violence turns deadly, investigators must reconstruct events using physical evidence, digital records, medical findings, and any available statements. Advocates stress that the absence of prior reports does not mean warning signs were absent, only that they may not have been formally documented. Law enforcement officials routinely note that many domestic homicide victims had limited contact with police before the fatal incident. Police have stated that the case against Lee is supported by evidence recovered at the scene. While details remain sealed, such evidence in stabbing cases typically includes forensic findings, blood pattern analysis, injuries consistent with defensive actions, and timelines established through phone data or witness accounts. Investigators may also examine communications between the victim and the accused, including text messages or call records, to establish context and potential motive. Again, officials have not disclosed whether such evidence exists in this case, but these tools are standard in modern homicide investigations. The prosecution's burden will be to demonstrate not only that Lee caused the fatal injuries, but that he did so with the level of intent required for first-degree murder under Tennessee law. Because Lee is a former NFL player, the case has attracted international coverage, including reporting by outlets such as the Times of India and other global news organizations. Legal analysts caution that widespread coverage can create misconceptions, particularly around timelines, charges, and legal definitions. Judges typically issue instructions to juries to disregard media coverage and base their decisions solely on evidence presented in court. In high-profile cases, courts may also consider additional measures during jury selection to ensure impartiality. Authorities have been deliberate in withholding the victim's identity. This approach aligns with common practice in cases involving domestic violence, particularly when releasing a name could further traumatize surviving family members or compromise ongoing proceedings. Victim advocacy organizations stress that protecting the dignity of the deceased is an essential part of responsible reporting and prosecution. The focus, they argue, should remain on accountability and justice rather than sensationalism. The case will now move through a series of procedural stages, including arraignment, pretrial hearings, and motions that will determine what evidence may be presented at trial. Prosecutors and defense attorneys are expected to begin assembling expert testimony, forensic analysis, and legal arguments. If the case proceeds to trial, jurors will be asked to evaluate complex and emotionally charged evidence. They will be instructed to apply the law as written, without regard to the defendant's former status or public reputation. While the defendant's background makes headlines, authorities stress that the underlying issue is far more common than many realize. Domestic violence-related homicides occur across all demographics, professions, and income levels. Fame does not prevent violence, and private conflicts can escalate with devastating speed. For investigators, prosecutors, and the courts, the goal now is clarity, to determine exactly what happened, why it happened, and whether the evidence proves the charge beyond a reasonable doubt. For the public, the case stands as a stark reminder that behind public images and athletic achievements can exist private realities that never make it onto a field or into a highlight reel. And at the center of this case is a life lost, one that will now be examined not through speculation, but through the measured, deliberate process of the criminal justice system. As the case advances beyond the initial arrest, investigators are now focused on assembling a timeline detailed enough to withstand courtroom scrutiny. According to law enforcement officials, the hours leading up to the fatal stabbing are central to understanding how the incident escalated and whether the evidence supports the elements required for a first-degree murder charge. In Tennessee, that means prosecutors must ultimately show not only that the accused caused the death, but that the killing involved the level of intent defined by state law. Police have indicated that the investigation relies on a combination of physical evidence, scene reconstruction, and digital records. In stabbing cases, forensic findings can be especially revealing. Bloodstain patterns, wound characteristics, and the location of injuries are often used to infer positioning, movement, and the sequence of events. Authorities have not publicly detailed these findings, but they have stated that the evidence recovered was significant enough to justify the charge filed. Digital evidence is also expected to play a role. Modern homicide investigations frequently involve analysis of mobile phone data, including call logs, text messages, location information, and app activity. Such data can help establish whether arguments occurred, whether either party attempted to seek help, and how movements before and after the incident align with physical evidence. Officials have not confirmed specific digital discoveries in this case, but they have acknowledged that electronic records are being reviewed as part of the broader inquiry. The accused, Darron Lee, remains in custody as the legal process unfolds. Court appearances in the early stages typically focus on procedural matters: formal notification of charges, the setting or review of bail conditions, and scheduling of future hearings. These proceedings are not about guilt or innocence, but about ensuring that the case moves forward in an orderly and lawful manner. Legal analysts note that first-degree murder charges are often filed early, when investigators believe the evidence supports the highest level of criminal liability. This does not preclude changes later in the process. Charges can be amended, reduced, or expanded as additional evidence is reviewed, and as prosecutors refine their theory of the case. Defense attorneys, meanwhile, begin their own investigation, examining every aspect of how evidence was collected and interpreted. A key issue likely to be explored is whether the fatal act was the culmination of a sudden confrontation or the result of a more deliberate sequence of decisions. Prosecutors may argue that certain evidence points to intent, while the defense may contend that the incident occurred during a volatile argument that escalated unpredictably. These distinctions are critical under the law and often determine how jurors evaluate responsibility. Domestic incidents that turn deadly often involve complex emotional dynamics. Experts caution against oversimplifying such cases, noting that they can involve fear, anger, control, and stress interacting in ways that are difficult to reconstruct after the fact. While these factors do not excuse violence, they can influence how events unfold and how they are interpreted legally. Authorities have been careful in their public statements, avoiding speculation about motive. Establishing motive can help a jury understand why a crime occurred, but it is not strictly required for a conviction. Prosecutors are expected to focus primarily on actions and evidence, rather than psychological explanations, unless those explanations are supported by admissible testimony. The decision to withhold the victim's name reflects both legal and ethical considerations. In domestic violence-related cases, privacy protections are often extended to prevent further harm to surviving family members and to avoid unnecessary exposure. Courts and law enforcement agencies generally prioritize dignity and restraint in such circumstances, especially when media interest is intense. Public reaction to the case has been shaped in part by the defendant's former professional status. Coverage by international outlets has amplified attention, sometimes blurring the line between verified facts and commentary. Judges routinely instruct jurors to disregard external coverage, but managing pretrial publicity remains an ongoing challenge in high-profile cases. Within the criminal justice system, there is an acute awareness that cases involving public figures require meticulous adherence to procedure. Any misstep, improper evidence handling, unclear documentation, or premature statements can become a focal point for defense challenges. Prosecutors therefore tend to proceed cautiously, building their case methodically rather than quickly. The defense is expected to examine the investigation for weaknesses. This includes questioning how the scene was secured, whether evidence was properly cataloged, and whether any statements were obtained in compliance with constitutional protections. In serious felony cases, defense teams often consult their own forensic experts to review autopsy findings, injury patterns, and timelines. Another aspect likely to receive attention is the nature of the alleged conflict leading up to the stabbing. Investigators may seek to establish whether there were signs of escalating tension, threats, or prior disputes. This can involve interviews with friends, neighbors, or acquaintances, as well as review of communications. Again, authorities have not disclosed whether such evidence exists in this case, but it is a common component of domestic homicide investigations. The broader context of domestic violence in the United States inevitably frames public discussion. Advocacy organizations consistently point out that many fatal incidents occur without prior criminal records or formal complaints. They stress that prevention requires awareness, resources, and intervention long before violence reaches a crisis point. From a legal standpoint, however, the court's focus remains narrow. Jurors are not asked to solve societal problems. They are asked to decide whether the prosecution has met its burden of proof in a specific case. That burden is intentionally high, reflecting the seriousness of the potential punishment and the value placed on due process. As pretrial proceedings continue, both sides will likely file motions that shape what evidence can be presented. Judges may rule on the admissibility of certain statements, the scope of expert testimony, and the relevance of prior events. These decisions can significantly influence how the case is ultimately argued. For the families involved, this phase of the process can be especially difficult. Court appearances, filings, and media coverage keep the incident in constant view, offering little space for private grief. Victim support services often emphasize the importance of counseling and community support during prolonged legal proceedings. The accused's family also faces uncertainty. Serious charges carry not only the risk of severe legal consequences, but also lasting reputational and personal effects. While public attention often focuses on the victim, and rightly so, the legal system recognizes that all parties are affected by the process. As the case moves closer to potential trial, attention will increasingly turn to how evidence is presented to a jury. Prosecutors will aim to tell a clear, evidence-based story. The defense will aim to introduce doubt, challenge assumptions, and remind jurors of the presumption of innocence. At this stage, much remains unresolved. What is known is that a woman lost her life, and a former professional athlete now faces one of the gravest accusations under the law. The truth of what happened will be determined not by headlines or speculation, but by testimony, evidence, and the careful application of legal standards. The justice system moves deliberately for a reason. In cases involving irreversible loss and severe punishment, speed is less important than accuracy. As proceedings continue, the focus will remain on establishing facts, testing claims, and ensuring that any outcome rests on proof rather than perception. For now, the case stands as a stark example of how private conflict can erupt into public tragedy, and how the law responds when it does. As the legal process continues, attention is increasingly turning to how the case may ultimately be presented to a jury. Prosecutors are expected to focus on building a narrative that connects physical evidence, forensic findings, and circumstantial details into a clear sequence of events. In homicide trials, especially those involving domestic relationships, the challenge is not only to establish what happened, but to demonstrate why the actions meet the legal threshold required for the specific charge. Under Tennessee law, first-degree murder carries an especially high burden. The prosecution must prove intent, as defined by statute, and that intent must be supported by evidence rather than assumption. This is why investigators place such emphasis on the nature of the injuries, the location of the wounds, and any indicators of a prolonged or escalating confrontation. Medical examiner testimony often becomes central, explaining how the injuries were inflicted and whether they are consistent with defensive actions or repeated force. In cases involving stabbing deaths, forensic experts may analyze the depth, angle, and distribution of wounds to help reconstruct what occurred. Multiple injuries can sometimes suggest sustained violence rather than a single impulsive act, though experts caution that each case must be evaluated on its own facts. Prosecutors are likely to argue that such findings, combined with scene evidence, help establish intent. The defense, by contrast, may argue that forensic interpretations are not definitive, and that alternative explanations remain plausible. Another area expected to receive scrutiny is the accused's behavior before and after the incident. Courts often allow limited consideration of actions such as attempts to flee, efforts to conceal evidence, or statements made to others, if they are relevant and lawfully obtained. Defense attorneys frequently respond by arguing that shock, panic, or confusion can explain behavior that might otherwise appear incriminating. Judges carefully regulate how such evidence is presented, aware of its potential impact on jurors. The role of expert testimony is likely to expand as the case moves forward. In addition to forensic pathologists, prosecutors may call digital analysts to explain how phone data or location information aligns with the timeline. Defense teams often counter with their own experts, challenging methodologies or offering alternative interpretations. These exchanges can become highly technical, and jurors must rely on judicial instructions to weigh credibility and relevance. Public discussion around the case has also intersected with broader conversations about domestic violence. Advocacy groups have emphasized that many fatal incidents occur in relationships that, from the outside, appear ordinary. Warning signs may be subtle or hidden, and victims may face barriers to seeking help. While these realities inform public understanding, courts remain focused on evidence specific to the case rather than generalized patterns. At the same time, legal observers note that domestic homicide cases can be particularly emotionally charged for jurors. Judges often issue explicit instructions reminding jurors to set aside sympathy or anger and to decide solely on the evidence presented. Jury selection in high-profile cases can be extensive, with attorneys questioning potential jurors about their ability to remain impartial despite media coverage. The defendant's background as a former professional athlete continues to shape public interest, but within the courtroom, it is largely irrelevant. Prosecutors are prohibited from arguing that fame or status makes someone more likely to commit a crime, just as the defense cannot argue that athletic achievement implies good character. The law demands that all defendants be judged by the same standards, regardless of past recognition. As pretrial motions are argued, judges will rule on what jurors are permitted to hear. This can include decisions about prior incidents, if any, or about the admissibility of certain statements. Such rulings often determine the contours of the trial long before opening arguments are delivered. Both sides understand that these early decisions can significantly influence the outcome. For the victim's family, the passage of time does little to ease the impact. Each court date renews attention on the loss, while the details discussed can be painful to hear repeatedly. Victim support professionals emphasize the importance of clear communication from prosecutors and access to counseling resources throughout the process. The accused family, meanwhile, faces a different kind of strain. Serious criminal charges can isolate families socially and emotionally, even before any verdict is reached. The justice system acknowledges this reality, but remains focused on ensuring a fair and lawful process. If the case proceeds to trial, opening statements will frame how jurors perceive the evidence from the outset. Prosecutors are expected to outline a coherent theory of intent and action, while the defense will likely emphasize uncertainty and the need for caution. Throughout the trial, jurors will be reminded that the burden of proof rests entirely with the state. The possibility of plea negotiations also exists in many cases, though there has been no public indication of such discussions here. Plea agreements, when they occur, reflect strategic decisions by both sides and are subject to judicial approval. Absent such an agreement, the case will move toward a full trial. Beyond the courtroom, the case has prompted renewed attention to the resources available for addressing domestic conflict before it becomes deadly. Law enforcement officials and advocates alike stress that early intervention, support services, and community awareness are critical components of prevention. These broader lessons, while not determinative in court, form part of the public response to tragedies of this kind. As proceedings continue, the central questions remain unresolved. What exactly happened in the moments leading up to the stabbing? Does the evidence establish intent beyond a reasonable doubt? Can alternative explanations withstand scrutiny? These are questions that only a jury, guided by law and evidence, can ultimately answer. What is already clear is that the case represents a profound personal loss and a severe legal reckoning. The justice system now carries the responsibility of examining the facts carefully, resisting both haste and bias, and reaching a conclusion grounded in proof. In that sense, the process itself becomes part of the story. It reflects society's effort to respond to violence, not with speculation or vengeance, but with deliberation, fairness, and accountability. As the case moves closer to its final phase, that commitment to law over impulse will define how the outcome is reached. The next stage will bring the most consequential decisions yet, as arguments are finalized and the evidence is prepared for judgment. The stakes could not be higher, and the path forward demands patience from all involved. As the case reaches its final stretch, the focus settles on the moment when the justice system must deliver its most difficult task, weighing loss against law and accusation against proof. What began as an emergency response to a domestic disturbance has become a full criminal prosecution, one that now hinges on evidence presented under oath and tested through cross-examination. Prosecutors are expected to distill months of investigation into a clear, linear account. Their argument will likely emphasize consistency, how physical findings align with medical testimony, how timelines synchronize with digital records, and how the totality of circumstances supports the charge. In their view, each strand of evidence reinforces the others, forming a narrative that satisfies the elements required under Tennessee law. The defense will ask jurors to slow down. They will urge careful separation of tragedy from criminal intent, arguing that the law demands certainty, not probability. Any ambiguity about sequence, state of mind, or interpretation of forensic detail will be framed as reasonable doubt. The presumption of innocence, they will remind jurors, is not a formality, but a protection meant to endure until the state meets its burden completely. Judicial instructions will anchor the process. Jurors will be reminded to disregard media coverage and to decide the case solely on what they hear and see in court. They will be told to evaluate credibility, to consider expert opinions without deferring to them automatically, and to apply the law impartially. In cases involving irreversible outcomes and severe penalties, these instructions are not procedural niceties. They are safeguards. Whatever verdict emerges will carry consequences beyond the courtroom. A conviction would affirm that the evidence met the highest standard and that accountability followed. An acquittal would affirm a different principle, that even in the face of profound loss, the law will not substitute emotion for proof. Neither outcome restores what was lost, but each reflects the system's commitment to fairness. For the family of the unnamed victim, the end of the trial marks a painful milestone. Court proceedings can provide answers, but they do not close grief. Support services and community care often become even more important after verdicts are read, when attention fades, but loss remains. For the accused, Darron Lee, the verdict will define the legal future. Fame and past achievements do not enter the deliberation room. Evidence does. That equality before the law, applied without favor or prejudice, is central to public confidence, especially in cases that draw intense attention. Beyond this single case, the broader conversation continues. Domestic violence remains a leading driver of lethal incidents in private spaces, frequently escalating without public warning. Prevention depends on early intervention, accessible support, and awareness that conflict behind closed doors can be as dangerous as any public threat. Courts do not solve these issues alone, but their rulings shape accountability and signal societal boundaries. As the jury's decision is reached and recorded, the legal process completes its work. What follows is reflection on how evidence was gathered, how arguments were made, and how the system performed under scrutiny. Transparency in that process, regardless of outcome, is how trust is maintained. This story is not about spectacle. It is about responsibility, restraint, and the rule of law confronting a human tragedy. When the courtroom doors close and deliberations end, the measure of justice will be found not in headlines, but in whether the verdict rests on proof and principle. If you value fact-checked, responsible, cinematic reporting that follows the evidence all the way to judgment, like this video to support serious journalism. Share it to keep the conversation grounded in facts, not rumor. And subscribe for more in-depth coverage that puts clarity before clicks. We don't rush conclusions. We respect the process, and we stay with the truth.